I'm essentially here, but two organisations for whom I have a lot of respect, and I'm a member of one, a long-term, 55 years member of Garden Organic and Soil Association before that, when I was an organic farmer. And it's been actually a great pleasure for me to know Moya and some of her team, people like Julia who've gone to work there. But I've been doing this for a long time, trying to get Britain to wake up about food policy. But I'm here to talk about. This is irritating me. Is it irritating you? The scratching? No, okay. What I'm here to talk about is a report which I spent 2.5 years doing and should have spent 1 year doing, or was budgeted to spend 1 year in time budgets. But it's become incredibly timely and constantly being downloaded. So if you want to go to sleep, you can download it. It's free. You just put my name in, Tim Lang, and just in case, because it's a lot of it is about just-in-time systems that we all get our food through. But it's about the title, Civil Food Resilience. And the background is very simple, and I need to give it to you. I retired age 73 4 years ago, thinking I would have a sort of nicer time, do a few things. I had one PhD student still to get rid of, to see through successfully. And I was doing a few little talks round and about, a couple around Westminster, those sort of circles. And in walks in the middle of one of them, someone I knew 40 years ago, when I first went to London for a year that turned into 41 years, who was a leader of a London council. And I wanted to see him because I'd come across the body, which I've done this report for, which he headed and indeed set up. Now he was in the Lords. He was a very sort of active Labour leader, but very centrist in the radical times of Thatcher government. Those of you who remember that. And he was a rarity. He was interested in food. And to cut a long story short, he was now in the Lords for 25 years, had been on intelligence and sort of behind the scenes committees, but still was doing a lot of social stuff. So I thought he was interesting. And I'd come across the National Preparedness Commission and thought, I used to teach Soviet politics at one point in my life, a long time ago. I thought it sounded straight out of the Soviet Union, the National Preparedness Commission. You know, in Soviet days, that would mean the complete obvious. It would mean Protect Stalin Commission, as opposed to the people. And in fact, they wanted to talk to me because they'd come to the conclusion someone needed to give them some thoughts on preparedness about food. And this was in that time of utter mess. Happened to be a conservative mess, but we didn't know how many prime ministers we'd have in a year. You know, things were not good. Brexit had happened, but chaotically, messily. It was disrupting the food system, lots of things going on. And to cut a long story short, they said, we'd like you to tell us some thoughts about preparedness and food. Well, we met and we talked, and I said, we agreed basically, look, I mean, they had then and still have very senior people from the inside secret state, you know, actually then ex-heads of MI5 and MI6 were commissioners, so I thought, this is a serious body. But then there were local authority people, and it's great in the good of other people, but it was an interesting sort of group. And if you knew Toby Harris, you'd understand why. This is an interesting, broad thinker. And to cut a long story short, I said, yes, I'll do it, but only if we can. My focus is on the public. I work in a public health department. I'm a social scientist, but I work on the public. I'm interested in how protected, how prepared, how ready for shocks is the public. Because I'd done a lot of work on that sort of area in and for a book that came out the week of COVID called Feeding Britain, published by Penguin, which sold out in a week. I thought, whoa, there are people out there who want to know about some of this stuff. So to cut a long story short, I said, Toby, I'll do it for you in a year. Well, that was a complete mistake on my behalf. I should have known better, because everything always takes longer. Even gardening always takes longer than you think it does, let alone other things. But I did. And part of the reason I was talking with Moya earlier, is because the more I went into it, the bigger it got. And I can't remember what my first slides are, but I think I'm probably not going to use these even. I don't know if you can even see that. But anyway, I had a sort of standard methodology. Ignore the slides, I'll just use them to talk me through it. And we'll get to the interesting bit. I'm trying to sort of whet your interest. Where did I start? Okay, a country in chaos, declining economic power, uncertain where it was in relation to where it gets a third of its food from, Europe. It still does. No thinking about the public, I thought. And I did what any good social scientist does. I went to talk to some people. I did a sort of semi-random group of people I knew, some I didn't. Said, do you think we're ready for shock? I talked to big shots, a couple of big shots in industry, a couple of people in academia, a few sort of speckling out. Who's most at risk? What do you think we need? Blah, blah, blah. And this unanimity came from even just this first 7. And by then I was reading, I was doing proper sort of academic searches, and indeed my report is very big, by the way. It's 360 odd pages with, I think, nearly 800 references. I mean, I gave my entire, you said 25 years, 55 years of academic work in this report, and it's yours for free. Download it, skim it, look for the bits in red, because they are always where ideas, I fly kites and say, look, this is being suggested, and then there's a very tight and very serious final chapter. If I was asked by a minister, which I have not been yet, this is what I would say to them. Here's the plan. Here's to save you some thinking. And gardens feature in it. The only steer, I was saying to you, someone, the only steer I got from the NatPrepCom, as I call it in a sort of semi-Soviet Union's way, the National Preparedness Commission, was from Lord Harris, who said, Tim, are you going to do anything on gardening? I said, might do. Depends if it comes up from the interviews. By then I was in a big series of rolling interviews. And it did. I thought that would be interesting and important, but I wanted it to come up. And it did. And there are whole sections in the report where I look at community gardens, big-scale gardens, how little food actually is produced from gardening. Let me be very stark. It's about 1-2% of food comes from gardens. But the potential for that to be much bigger. I talked with people from Sheffield University, and Peter Jackson and that team has been really good on this, looking at the potential for towns in Britain to grow more. And it becomes, where's Julia Wright now? We're talking earlier, there's Julia Wright, talking about, the legacy of the Cuban outlet. It's actually not hard, high-rise Britain which can produce more food. It can actually, but it's peri-urban, which is where the most potential for close to people becomes important. Basically, I had a methodology. I asked a lot of people. I, in the end, did 10 country studies to look at what other countries doing. I looked not just at what was officially going on, but what unofficially were going on. So I was very interested in and explored the social movements around food, the sustainable food places. Leon Ballon is here. Where's Leon? Where is he? Leon's here from Sustainable Food Places. This really interesting movement of cities and towns that have got together around, not around shocks actually, but partly, and is now beginning to have to address that. I talked with senior captains of industry. All my interviews were anonymous. I did over 70, and believe you me, I've advised select committees. I've been in front of select committees. They don't ask anything like that to produce a lot of people. I would ask for half an hour, and people would give me 2 hours, and I would have to stop them because they were pouring out what they really thought. And just skim through my report. They're all offset in italics. You can look at the quotes. They are utterly utterly riveting, from people who will, in public, say slightly different things. But I was getting, and I'm not criticizing them for that at all, please be assured, they were saying what they could say, really, but what they can't say very often in their circumstances. So I basically produced a report. I started asking, I had a standard, very short sort of set of questions. Are we ready for sharks? Who's going to be most at risk? What do you think needs to be done? Very obvious things. And that set of questions evolved, it changed over time as I was getting more information, was digging up more, getting more data. So I was running lots of, as we do in research, lots of things going on. And I should have had a budget of about £1 million. I had nothing. It was me. I employed 2 researchers for my own money. Okay, I'm a well-paid, pensioned off 5-star professor, so I'm not poor. Okay, and the deal was then done. They'd give me an honorarium at the end, so that's been actually paid off. Okay, but not a lot, I assure you, nothing for what it is. But maybe someday I should say how much it is, because people will gasp. But anyway, I'm not out of pocket. But I was doing this literally because I thought it was the most important thing I've ever been asked to do. And to cut a long story short, it got me into very theoretical stuff. What's resilience? What do we mean by resilience? It's this term, it comes really, it's Latin. How good are you at Latin? Resilio. It's the concept of bouncing back after a shock. And it's used in very different ways by different disciplines. In academia, I think we have a real problem, Moya. It's used differently from physicists to architects to psychologists. My PhD was in social psychology. I was actually interested in that post-Second World War branch of educational and social psychology and clinical psychology that dealt with people in trauma. You know, can children bounce back if they've been brought up in a concentration camp? Can they bounce back if their parents are killed? You know, these are emotional crises from which the notion of resilience can be very useful as a concept. So it means different things to different people. And one of the boring to some people, but deeply interesting to people in academia, chapters at the beginning where I unpick those differences. So an ecologist will say resilience is about, well, the change, we're in climate change, there's always been climate change, but it's accelerating and we don't quite know how it's going to shape. Won't bounce back to where it was, it'll bounce to something different. That's a very different notion of resilience to, I always quote my step-grandson, who is an architect. They're trained for, if the building is bombed or is in an earthquake, it won't fall down. It cannot move, actually. It can move, but not move. So this notion of resilience, I really want to stress to you, means different things to different bodies. And to a secret state, it means the order continuing. To a government, it means command and control being operated in a crisis. To civil society, to a local authority, we have people from local authorities here, it may mean something radically different. So I find myself, my voice goes, getting into really complicated sort of philosophical academic thinking. But this afternoon we're going to have a seminar just talking about that through with the researchers. But the point about it is everyone brought me back to reality all the time. You can't see this, but we are in, and even people who are captains of food industries will acknowledge to me that there is what we in academia call the polycrisis. It's not one shock, but multiple shocks are happening. And mostly, very quickly, mostly, come in, mostly the shocks have focused on what thinking has been about supply, not about you or us as consumers. It's not been about public resilience. My favorite story against myself when I was a teacher in a polytechnic, which will be nameless, at a high skybreaker, this guy was out looking out the window, showed no interest in me at all. I said, do you mind me saying, what are you looking at? He said, see there, Dr. Lang. I was not a professor then. See there, Dr. Lang. When you speak, I see pigs flying past. And I'm looking at the pigs, they're flying past. We were 14 stories up, so don't worry, I can cope with everything. I'm a Polytechnic trained. You're not going to see it ever, I don't think, so don't worry about it.
If you would turn to the right, we can see it a bit more.
Oh my God, the technology. This is why I like just speaking. It's the technology. I blame Fiona.
Yeah, blame me.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're in a polycrisis is the point. There are multiple shocks. That's what everyone agrees. The data agreed. I would talk to Chatham House people. I would talk to, climatologists. I would talk to water people. And then when I started going to public health people, we've got John Middleton here, ex-head of Director of Public Health at Sandwell, a pioneer of food and public health. We started getting weaker, John. Weaker in public health. It was firefighting heart disease and obesity and vaccinations and things, but this was an agenda that was too big, and yet the origins of public health was about dealing with shocks and dealing with contagions from the 19th century onwards. So I realized very early we were going to have to deal with a very wide range of shocks, and one of the second interesting things that came out of my work is that there is no typology of resilience. There's no typology of food shocks and what resilience would look like. There is no typology which does that in relation to the type of shocks and whether it affects people materially, nutritionally, psychologically, sociologically, culturally. That is what I think is needed, and my report is really about that. And it comes down to some very simple things. We can have chronic shocks. They're sort of normalized. You take them for granted. We've forgotten that they are actually shocks to the ecosystem of the food. We can have acute shocks where it's wham bang, something big. We have long and short-term shocks. We have slow burn and fast burn ones. I really like that notion. So David Omand, who's one of the National Preparedness Commissioners, ex-head of GCHQ, has a fabulous Penguin book, by the way, last year on crises, with whom I discussed. And he really liked my report, which was nice. Slow burn and fast burn is a really important thing. When it comes to local authorities, that may be really critical. What have you got going on in Rugby? There's a councillor from Rugby here. What have you got going on which could accelerate if X happens? And right from the beginning, people were saying to me, the key thing is we've got to prepare for not single crises, but multiple crises. That's a common theme. And the lack of preparation within the state. I couldn't find any list. No one had a list of shocks. No one seemed to have thought about it, except very late in my second year, it turned out that an emergency food committee that had been closed in COVID, but turned into something slightly different at the suggestion, no, I tell you it's truth, it's all there and documented in my report. You could write a very, very, very nasty report about this lack of preparedness of Britain, let me tell you, but I was trying to write a very measured, calm report. In COVID, two food companies, who will be nameless, went to the government and said, do you not think we should think about what might COVID do to food suppliers? And the government of the day, which in my humble opinion was useless, said, good, let's do it. So a thing called the Food Resilience Industry Forum was created. No public on it, no civil society, just a small cabal. But one of the things it did was very interesting, again, written in my report, was emergency powers were suspended. One of the people I interviewed was a former Solicitor General, said, Tim, we can deal with anything in a crisis, emergency powers. And you will see a very succinct account of the Emergency Powers Act in my report. I've done a lot of homework for you, I can tell you. The problem is they only get activated in the crisis. And it's not about preparedness. So it's a slide. I don't know if you can see it. If I had 30 seconds with a minister, I'd say, do you realize government actually 2 years ago did an exercise across the whole of the British state. What would happen if electricity went down? How many of you store food? I should ask you this early on. You'd expect that of this sort of audience. Okay. Let me just now say, how do you store that food? You've just laughed. You get the point. Cellar, okay. Not many houses these days are built with cellars. Most cellars in my street in London have been turned into video cinemas, literally. Cinemas for the kids and underground stuff. I live in what wasn't a posh street, but now is a posh street in London. It's quite staggering. But cellars weren't actually, they were partly for food storage. But let me sorry. Tin. Okay, well, your brains are going. Your brains are going much more than the state's brains have gone, let me assure you. How many of you have looked at the Prepare website? How many of you know there is a Prepare website? There you go. One, two. But you only know it because of me. So that's cheating. No, this is why. By the way, this is my 36th talk since my report came out. So I'm doing a roadshow, basically, to try and get discussion to happen. Because if government won't listen, we have to raise it up. But governors, in fact, a report came out yesterday from the Government Food Strategy Report, and it actually does flag my report right at the beginning, which is, to me, actually good, because it's a sign of that there is thinking going on. I'll tell you more about that later. Electricity outage, number one likelihood. It was done in an operation across the whole of the British state, but basically no one thought about food in it. Ransomware is now not out of control, but the fastest rising impact in the food manufacturing sector particularly. Before my report came out, some people said, oh, well, why is ransomware going to affect it? Now we've had Emeritus and CAWR go down. I'm actually going to the Orkneys in early September. The island's council wants to talk to me. Why? The co-op was the only shop servicing them. So what happened in that? The public catering kicked in. And actually public catering, the school meals catering, all these residues of the state thinking about stuff start coming in. And there's a big theme in my report about in chapter 12, the recommendations that popped up several times across it, which is really we need to do what I call in the report, borrowing from some academics, community audits of community food assets. Communities have more assets than they think they have. Your area may have someone whose job is running a food stall at a rock concert. I've never been to Glastonbury, it's my idea of complete hell. But I have actually appeared in the theatre group at Latitude with my baby sister-in-law who's an actress. And it's staggering, 55,000 people fed in something that did not exist a week earlier. These are facilities, these are people who are used to doing fast and churning it out, have got equipment. What if those are put together? What has Coventry got in terms of access to mass catering? And we don't mean, the big multinational Sodexos. I mean mass decentralized catering, which is able to withstand shocks because one company can be taken out very easily. One major finding of thinking about resilience is don't centralize. What has Britain done? Centralize and contract out. And partly a radical undertow in my report, coming from very senior people, was we need to decentralize more. That's a really interesting thing. I need to go faster. Well, AI bot attacks, welcome anyone who follows Ukraine or follows lots of things, internet failure. There's a major issue. One area where academics have actually begun to be good is looking at what we call choke points. In supply chains, we did a study in our centre in London, 17 years ago, looking at the bread industry. There are choke points in it where mass bread closes down if one additive goes. One additive. what would that look like? In COVID, you couldn't buy bread, bread flour, not because there was a shortage of bread flour, because the packaging industry had it in 100-weight bags or 50-kilo bags and couldn't get it into small bags. So the choke point might be something very different from what you think it is. And in Frith, the Food Resilience Industry Forum took over from the emergency committee that was closed down in COVID, developed some assessments of where particular pinch points might exist. I cannot find that. I do not know who has that. It exists, and I'm on the trail. So, I can understand, let me be frank, why that would be kept secret. But we need to do that at community level. We need to have directors of public health to lead research work doing that, working with local academics. Find out where are the pinch points in your area. Where is it? There's a key table in my report. How many shops are there in Britain? 9 supermarkets, 94.5%. It is at the moment those 9 supermarkets have of the home purchased food. 94% from just 9 companies. Okay, so if even 2 small ones, Co-op and Emeritus, go out, that's 10%. 9%, 10% gone. Okay, where does their food come from? It's trucks on motorways. When I invented the concept of food miles 30 years ago, it was 1 in 4 trucks was food, half of which are empty, they're going back. It's now 1 in 5 because the motor traffic has gone up. Now where do they go? So if you're a manufacturer, anyone who knows their food logistics, and the logistics industry, by the way, were absolutely key to my thinking in this. They were incredibly useful and helpful. And I borrowed the title from them. They said, Tim, what we really should be doing is not just in time. They've spent 50, 60 years getting rid of storage. It's completely brilliant. When you go to a supermarket or small local store, blip, it's adding up your bill, you think. It isn't. It's reordering. And it's adding your bill up. And it's taking who you are and where you're from and doing a diagnosis and all that social stuff. But the just-in-case stuff is really, really important. Why? It's all software. What's the easiest thing to infiltrate? This is a complex web of efficiency, done for market reasons, for industrial reasons, for capital returns. We might demonize, some people demonize, I've been known to demonize big retailers. They make their returns on capital are small, actually, 1 to 2%. You can make more money in catering very quickly, but you're likely to go bust in your 3rd year in a catering enterprise. So we've got all of these different sorts of disruptions. And the key thing Chatham House raised 7 years ago was the cascade effect. What if this knocks onto that to that? And we're actually in an experiment right now over water in Britain. We're going to see, it looks like all the prognosis are the harvest this year is going to be down. Who cares, says ordinary thinking. We just buy it. Really? And on top of that are all the public health problems. People don't know how to cook. They think food is available all the time. They don't store. You're very unusual, by the way, if you store food. Most people don't store. They can't afford to store. This is not a whole of society approach. The vulnerabilities are amazing. Britain doesn't produce its own food. It hasn't since the 18th century, so don't get worked up about it. It's been declining. It went up to 80% when we were members of the European Union. It's now declined to about 60%. Depends how you calculate it, by tonnage, by nutrition, by value added or whatever it all means. But basically it's down. Okay. But yet it could go up. You can have all the slides, by the way. They're for you. Anyone want the slides? You can have them. Don't write to me, write to Moya. I get far too many emails already, but if you get stuck, come back to me. This is what I wanted. You can't see it. I spent a long time actually trying to find out how many stores do the supermarkets have. You can find out how many shops they each have. Tesco has 2,048 small stores, 809 large stores, but they go through just 20 hubs. So 20 hubs provide 1/3 of the food of Britain. Can you imagine that if you wanted to be aggressive? Do you want me to repeat it? And at the end, you'll see at the bottom of this table, this is from the report, about 131 hubs, what we used to call regional distribution centres, but then they're known in the trade as DCs. So when you see those trucks with food, they're going to drop it at a DC, so at a distribution centre. Conveniently, they're on the M1, the M6, they're always by motorways somewhere. And they get thinner the further away you go from the centres of distribution. So these are sort of vulnerabilities which we can map. I won't talk about that, but one of the things I, as a psychologist gone wrong, I'm really interested in is going back to some of that really important stuff from the 1940s and 50s and 60s psychology of how do people react in trauma, in shocks. There's really interesting work. I don't know if you've got a psychology department here or your clinical stuff, but in academia there's really interesting psychiatric work that's developed thinking about responding to shocks, helping people. I support a charity called Freedom from Torture, of dealing with people, they're absolutely wiped out by shock. You can get people like that, and some people, anyone at my age, I was born in 1948, we knew people who'd gone through concentration camps and they never spoke. It was all internalized. Now we're sort of download your brain at the drop of a hat, and the word crisis is used to mean trivia. You can't get something on the internet, There's culturally, we've gone slightly odd, in my humble view. But what would the British public act like? That's my point. That's a big unknown my report raises. We do not know how rich society cultures would deal with big shocks. You can say we've got a working example at the moment in Gaza. Whatever you think about Israel, Gaza, there is an astonishing brutalization and using of food as decoys and all sorts of things I personally think are ghastly, but whatever your view, I come from a family that supported the creation of Israel, so I'm not making any comments about that, but just look at Ukraine. Ukraine is actually much more interesting for us. It's getting closer. You can't ever say the Palestinian people were given a sort of modern consumerist society opportunity. They weren't and aren't, and there's no chance of that at the moment. But in Ukraine, you've got something. How are they doing? Well, it's much more decentralized, actually, is the short answer. And there was an avenue I started wanting to go down and thought, I can't go there. That sort of thing, if you've got friendly, Ukraine or Eastern European academics on your books, this is something we should be exploring. What's the experience of dealing with food shocks when nightly drones plus ransomware plus public disinformation, Trump style, gets really nasty and heavy? That can all happen to food, basically. But the good news, which I did not expect, is the British state has an amazingly good framework expecting and preparing us for shocks. Did you know that? Yes, says one person, two people nod. I didn't know that, except I did because I'd come across it in researching my Feeding Britain. On the left, there's a very sophisticated process of what's called the National Risk Register, which has just updated. This is the front cover of the 2023. How many risks officially face Britain today? Anyone tell me? 89. How many of them are food? Guess. None? You're a bunch of cynics. One. One. That is what all my senior interviewees who were on the inside track absolutely couldn't accept. And one of my really brutal recommendations is we must have a better risk register looking at food. Why? Because it gets translated into community risk registers. They literally, so your local authority, the lady from Rugby, your local community risk register in your local resilience forum, which is set up under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. Anyone knew that you have Local Resilience Forum, some of you are nodding. It's basically Blue Light Brigade. So if this tent blew up or burnt down, they would arrive. That's the civil contingency stuff. Those people, when I went and interviewed them and surveyed them, they said, look, we see food coming, we don't know what can do it. We're ambulance people, we're fire brigade people. You know, this is beyond our ken. And they said, you know, when we spoke to them, by now I had my two researchers, what would you like? They said, well, this is DEFRA's problem. Well, the cynics among you laugh, but it is DEFRA's problem, but DEFRA just thinks it's okay to sort it out at the top, which is why the report that came out, or the strategy document that came out yesterday is important, because it's beginning to shift that. But on the right is the most important document, which is the Government Resilience Framework. There is an official Government Resilience Framework, and actually, it's good. I couldn't believe it. I was, you know, in critical academic mode. It's very good, except it's all central state. Doesn't come down to the real level at all. It's good mainly because it has three great principles. Whole of society, whatever we do, it must be the whole of society. Well, if you're just looking at the central state, that's not the whole of society. It must be about prevention, not cure. Good public health people like John Middleton and me know that's rule number one in public health. And the third is build a shared understanding of the risks. Well, there's no shared understanding of the risks. The food industry does not see the National Risk Register as covering all the risks in the minutiae when you get down to local supermarket level. Okay, it's not to say it's bad, it's just not thinking foods. So a big recommendation of mine was to take seriously something also that we have in Britain, which is good, which is that we have a system known as critical national infrastructure. Food is one of now 14 critical national infrastructures. Britain has actually been a leader in this sort of thinking, trying to persuade countries to say, what do you need to survive? What do you need to build your daily lives around in a good way? Food's always been one of them. And in my Feeding Britain book, when I couldn't believe the stupidity of what the annual report on critical national infrastructure of food was. It just said basically, everything's fine. There's no shortage of food. There's no thinking about the possibility of things going wrong. I'm glad to say that is slightly shifting now. When you've got a prime minister who said not once but twice, we've got to be on a war footing. What does that mean? Unless you start taking the critical national infrastructure seriously. I need to speed up. We have state powers. One of the deviations that went on endlessly in my research process was trying to uncover what was left of civil defense. Civil defense in the 1930s was started preparing for war. The Spanish Civil War accelerated it. You may say, what's that got to do with food? Well, actually, there was a civil food defense. It was called British restaurants. It was having food, preparing people for if there are crises. Many of you have got food banks and food pantries in your areas. These need to be, they've come to the end of their value. They're sticking plaster. They will tell you that, whatever you think of them. But they've got to become something else. And what would that be? How would it happen? What's the process? Who would operate it? How would it be organized? We need to be doing that sort of thing. But the Treasury was incredibly helpful to me. The Ministry of Defence budget at the moment is about £55 billion. How much do you think goes on civil defence? That's protecting you. It's less than £1 a person, £65 million a year. Okay, and with the geopolitics of the last 3 years, now rapidly helped by Mr. Trump, one of the only things I really support him on, it's good that NATO is increasing to 5%. We've actually piggybacked on unaccountability in all sorts of ways, and I think it's one of the points my report says, we've got to put the social, the people, at the center of what we mean by defense. And there's if you're interested in this, I drew a lot upon Scandinavian thinking in this. I actually, two of my 10 country studies, one was of Sweden and one was of Latvia. And they have this notion of what's called total defense. So Sweden 10 years ago, said if Russia invades us, remember it invaded the Crimea in 2014, we're wiped out. We've got a very sophisticated navy, very sophisticated aircrafts and army, etc. But the the Russians have got a very big and powerful army. They could walk all over us. So the assumption built into Sweden's defense strategy is that the people will have to be involved in their own defense. That doesn't mean to say it's only up to the people, but they said this is this concept of total defense. And I pick up and run with that in the report, picking up on the interviewees and say, we need a concept of total food defense. What would a more resilient food system look like where feeding the people was the priority? That must, I can imagine some of you thinking, this man is slightly loopy. We know this is markets, you can't have that. Unknown to me and unknown to the people through whom I went in Sweden, the Swedish government was doing a report inquiry while I was doing mine, but it was done from inside the state and it came out last year. Its conclusions were exactly the same as mine. We have to build, didn't call it total food defense, we've got to rebuild stockpiling, we've got to diversify our food system, we've got to engage the public in its own protection, we've got to build community around food. And some of the military people I interviewed said one of the things that has to go very quickly if you want good preparedness is meism. I'm all right, I've got a larder, I've got a cellar. My deep freeze works from my solar panels with battery lockup. Forget it. The military people said, it's community. Military people. It's us. One of them said, memorably to me, it's not me, it's us, us. And that's right. And that's not rocket science. And why am I even having to say that to us? It's because we've had 60 to 70 years of a consumerist me. I can have anything I want whenever I like and the food system will deliver it. And it has. So this is tricky stuff. What needs to happen? You can't see this, but at the end of the report, there are lots of organograms, the state from the central state. A key finding of my report was that the gap between the central state and those really good principles and what actually could or might happen at the local level is enormous. So my report's subtitle was about how can we narrow the civil food resilience gap. And that notion is, I think, really important. Because what we have, planning we have, is good, but entirely predicated on single crises. It's not dealing with climate change, it's not dealing with what if some really big changes happened on the Ukraine war. There's a very likely scenario of Ukraine losing, and then lots of other things happening. What if? You have to explore what if. That's what we do in public health, so why not on those? So there are tables like this, organograms like this in the report from central government down to local. We've got the now well-known COBRA system in a crisis, the Cabinet Office meeting room becomes the crisis centre. We've now actually created a new body called the National Situation Centre. Well, I don't know whether that's doing anything on food, not that I know of. There is a resilience directorate now bringing together various bits of the state. I think this is all good, but it's not translated down to the local level. And above all, it's all based upon assuming one crisis. Back to the beginning of my talk, we're in an era of polycrisis. I make all sorts of recommendations. More engagement with the public, that's you, me, councils. We've got to raise our food production more where it's appropriate. If you don't think that's necessary, look at the sections of my report upon where food flows in. 20-25% of food flows just into London through Eurotunnel and Dover, Folkestone. Okay, that's run by a private police force, by the way. A private police force. We've got to begin the shift away from just in time. We've got to rebuild storage. We've got to do buffer stocks. All sorts of things that have gone out of fashion. Some of the retailers said to me after the report, said, look, we could be part of building those buffer stocks and storage. And I said, but you spent 60 years getting rid of it. Are you saying suddenly you're going to build an even bigger warehouse behind? Maybe. Who knows? I don't know about that. Something I think that's something we could research. Sorry, you could research. We've got to decentralize more. We've got to do some of the things that were seen as stupid or old-fashioned. Bioregionalism, not centralization. We've got to, I think, completely reform the National Risk Register with regard to food. I call for a new food risk register system. I want, under the ethos and the title of mapping community food assets, I think that can be done. Leon knows. I think sustainable food places should and could pick up and run with this. He's nodding. Good. You know, I'm pouring out these ideas, but they're based upon what I found out. I think we need a new system of civil resilience committees. That's the government calling us. By the way, did you notice you all had a phone call alert a year ago? I mean, I have to say I smile at things like that. How is that going to work if certain things happen? I think we need new legislation. I do not see how we can do what's needed without legislation setting tasks. And again, I was so relieved, I cannot tell you. We researchers never, of course, sweat and are nervous about what we've done or said. But I was actually at various points sweating, thinking, my God, why am I? How can I get this in? You know, what people are suggesting I do, this is going to be too much. But the Swedish government report, which is called Food Preparedness for a New Era, it's 300 pages long, so practice your Swedish or Google Translate it. It's a very good report. It says we need to have legislation insisting that mayors, so local government, where's the councillor? She's had to go, actually. It's a shame from rugby. She said she was going early, but I've already told her this. That mayors should be responsible and given one instruction to prepare for their municipality to feed people in a crisis. When I spoke to Swedish people when the report had come out, I said, why did you do that? Because if it's not in the law, it won't happen. It can be bypassed, you know. It then becomes, even if there's no money to do it, but you've then got the demand to do it. And you've got a doubling of the defence budget in the next 7 years. That's a lot of money, Fiona, for civil food resilience to come in under 1.5% of GDP. And I am asking us to think very seriously about civil food resilience as part of taking food infrastructure seriously. So lots of recommendations, lots of stuff you'd all agree with, I would think, from the people I know here, that, you know, if we want to have good feeding in the communities, you've got to think about the infrastructure of that community. The poorer the community, the worse the infrastructure. The richer the community, the more arrogant they think they're okay, and they're not. And above all, we've got to prepare for multiple crises, because that's what the scenarii now say. And for that, I think we need to have, we've got the multi-level there from Cabinet Office and all the fancy stuff, COBRAs, resilience committees, etc. We've got the blue light brigades under the 42 local resilience forums, 38 in England, 4 in Wales, 4 similar ones in Scotland, 2 in Northern Ireland. But they can't deal with food. We've got to have more organised civil representation thinking about food. So a lot of my report at the end is about that, to engage the public. And that's not being scary. It's scary to do nothing, is what my interviewers said to me. I'll leave that. So I'll end with this. Basically, at the end of my report, I say, look, why don't we do what the Swedes have done, which is say good civil food resilience is about feeding, the goal is to feed all people well. So that's why people like public health, they're fighting an uphill battle on that. The strategy that came out from DEFRA yesterday, I think, is optimistic on that. It's saying we must address this. It's picked up on the Dimbleby analysis in the National Food Strategy, which I think is good. But it also picks up on my report and says we've got to be tighter and better about resilience. In fact, resilience gets more outcomes that they want than any other heading of the report. So I'm actually very pleased about that. You know, it's a little effect of my report, I gather. But I think we've got to be much tougher, less touchy-feely about food, you know, and I'm being critical here of us in the organic movement here. You know, oh, it's all right as long as it comes organic food. It's as long as that's there, it's okay. Everyone will live longer and be happier. And you know, come on, crisis thinking becomes very different. So I think this is a time where getting people together and dealing and facing with shocks can actually be very, very, very sobering and very good, but is about building on all the things many of you in this room already do, the community level up to the different level. But integration from the national level to the local level, it seems to me, is critical. Is this likely to come? Well, you know, I write reports, Moya writes reports, academics, we churn out papers, we know they sink without trace mostly, but sometimes they get through. And why I'm on this tour this year of going, it's just try and let you know, get that damn report. Download it, take it to your MP, take it to your town council and say, could we do a community, you know, a mapping of our community assets? Maybe you've already done it. Work through the sustainable food places. The local government association, when I went to meet them, said, we'd love to do this, but, well, you know, circumstance will make that but become, okay, it's going to be difficult, but we'll have a go. I think it can begin in small ways. I'm just corresponding at the moment with people I worked with a long time ago in Finland. It's just staggering what Finland is doing. There's that great big pressure of a bear on the longest country border in Europe. It concentrates the mind. And I speak this as a very proud Brit. Our arrogance is astonishing. Our reflex very often is to think, we're okay. It's okay, we're rich. I always think of the Cabinet Office researcher said, Tim, we don't need to worry about food, we can buy it. Really? Not in a just-in-time knocked-out system, you can't. I'll skip all of this. Yeah, I'll skip all of this. Oh, here's the Prepare website. You should be informed, make a plan, prepare your home, talk to others, get emergency supplies, have a battery wind-up torch, a mobile portable power bank, a battery wind-up radio, spare batteries, a first aid, sanitizers, bottles of water. Who was the genius who said, what about a few tins? How many of you store tins? Yeah. Bottles. We need to rethink it. One of my recommendations is for a body probably most of you don't know exists called SACN, Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. I want that to do a proper study of what dietary recommendations would it actually make for not 3 days emergency, but what about 2 weeks emergency? The Swedes, the Finns, the Latvians all prepare for 5 to 7 days. I will never, ever forget being in the Latvian embassy in London, where I'd written to them, you know, I wrote to about 20 embassies, 10 got back, and were very helpful. And one was Latvia, and it turned out the person in the Latvian embassy was the person who, when Russia invaded Crimea and annexed it, was asked by their government to prepare their preparation systems, a lawyer. And he said he would meet me. I didn't know any of this. And he was literally in a room this big, okay? And he was sat over there and I was over here. And he said, do you really want to know, Professor Lang? I said, I do. And he ran out of the room. I thought, well, this is interesting. And he came back 5 minutes later with a stack here, which he gave me. He said, we set up a system where we told the public, this is Latvia, remember? It's very close to Russia. I don't want to demonize Russia, by the way, except it does concentrate the minds of some people. So we tell the people, he said, here it is in English, here it is in Latvian, here it is in Russian. There will be no government. It will have collapsed. You're on your own. Not as an individual, we want you to be working at a community level to know now and to prepare now. So they did cards. They have got a website, actually. It's in English, too. It's in my report. You can see it all. With advice. But it's also down to preparing at that local level. So residents' associations, those street WhatsApps that have got people who never knew who their neighbours were to meet their neighbours, those need to be got going in some better way, you know, is what they said. What am I going to do? Oh, I put on a really hideous slide. That's code to me to say shut up. There were some interesting tables in it which I compiled for the wonks, policy wonks in here. What actually can the public do? You can go and get depressed and think, oh my God, I wish I hadn't gone to that talk. Or you can think, actually, we need to think, what would stockpiling look for rugby? What would it look like for this area around here? Bob, what would your village look like? Bob lives in the village. What would that look like? Who could do it? Who would organise? Skill development, grow more food. You know, I was deeply moved talking to community cafes, community gardens in Edinburgh, in northeast Flintshire, poor areas where they'd set up community gardens. 6 people got a group of community gardens going, involving 160 families, building skills, sharing, building those solidarities that become important in crises. So gardening, Fiona knows my line on this, gardening is a social vector. Gardeners help each other sometimes. They're terribly competitive at other times. My beans are better than your beans. No, they're not actually, mine are worse. Down to the city level, I went to Belgium and looked at a Sheffield, Liège. People had told me, go to Liège. It was deindustrialized like Sheffield, but has rebuilt some pride with what is called the food belt around it, restarting horticulture around the edge. Not in a big way. I went and it's not as big as you might think it is. It isn't. But it echoes Julia Wright's sort of work that she did in Cuba, or how people had to get together and do stuff. Where's Julia? Julia's not there. She's escaped already. So food belts, social networks, there are lots of things. There are lots of things in my report which are just to spark your interest, that people raised or that the literature said. So I've done a lot of work to save you a lot of time, basically. And my year is just running around sharing with people. Yeah, I do want to really stress this is about total food defense. I'm absolutely hardline, I'm afraid. Food is being weaponized. It's a way to break people. We're seeing it in 3 places on the planet at the moment: Sudan, Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine. Why could it not happen here? And we need to share those sort of thinking. What's the role of gardening in this? You can't see these pictures. There's Flintshire. Actually, the Flintshire people just said, what's great is we get together and we have big dinners together. And in Granton, which I still haven't been to, an area of Edinburgh, sort of council housing, they built it up. There's a fabulous photo there I put in of them having an annual dinner, lunch. You know, it's just getting people together in the name of growing food. They dug up the ground around their housing blocks. You know, lots of obvious stuff. But it's great. And of course, the great example, Detroit, of what can be done at scale. Again, I don't want to over-romanticize it. Okay, I'm going to stop. For academics, this afternoon, I'm spending the afternoon with the Coventry people talking about, there's a big agenda for academics to contribute to this process, I think. So I'll be talking about that. I think that's it. Yeah, it is. Oh, yeah, actually, my favourite slide in the whole of my report is this, which is actually from a report from 1962. And I'm either getting old and incontinent, which I don't think I am. Incompetent, yes, but not incontinent yet, I hope. But I read this when I was a PhD student in 1970. This was the RAND Corporation, a breakaway from the American military, R-A-N-D, R, Research and Development, that's what the word RAND comes from. It's still a very, very smart consultancy group. It's actually done a brilliant report for the British military. I cite it and reproduce bits of it in my report. This was done in 1962. What would happen, Paul Baran was asked at the RAND Corporation, what would happen to the telecommunications system of the US? He said, well, in the end, he said, look, we can have a typology of three sorts. One is what we've got at the moment, a highly centralized system where you've got these hubs, one hub with lots of spokes. You can decentralize it. You can say, well, let's break up the big hubs and just have a few. He called that a decentralized system. And then he said, what if we thought really big and did what he called a distributed system? No hubs, or so micro hubs that they're very hard to disrupt. That thinking stayed with me after my first year of doing my research. I just thought this is such a powerful notion. And if there's one slide, I would show the minister, who says he wants to meet me for dinner, which is quite good. It's that. We are here. Think of my slide I showed you, 12,040 shops of the 9 supermarkets, 121 hubs. What would it take to shift along that spectrum? That's actually the hard thing in my report, because I can assure you they don't want to do it. There's trillions of pounds of investment in the current system. But there's one thing that's shaking it, which is that they know it's wobbly. Why? They told me. It's in my interviews. Read it.